welcome to this discussion of women, politics and the press, the first of two panels live streamed today as part of our Festival of Women Writers and Journalists, a centenary celebration of Time and Tide. My name is Catherine Clay and I'm Director of the Time and Tide Connections and Legacies project. I'm delighted that so many people have joined us this afternoon to learn more about the history of this remarkable feminist magazine and to consider the status of women in journalism today. Founded in May 1920, Time and Tide was unique in establishing itself as the only female-edited weekly review in Britain, competitive with the New Statesman, and it vigorously championed women's equality with men in public and political life. 100 years on, I'm excited by the opportunity in this panel to consider how far we have come since Time and Tide's first publication, particularly with regard to spheres of print journalism from which women have been historically excluded. It's my huge pleasure, therefore, to introduce our chair of this panel, Dr. Sarah Lonsdale, Senior Lecturer in Journalism at City University, London. Sarah has been a journalist for 25 years, starting out on the Reading Chronicle and then the Observer newspaper as a general reporter. She continues to write freelance for numerous magazines and newspapers. Sarah is also author of two books on the history of journalism, the second of which, Rebel Women Between the Wars, is just out with Manchester University Press. Our pre-recorded festival programme includes a short presentation by Sarah from this book, and I warmly encourage you to take a look at this if you haven't done so already. For now, I will hand you over to Sarah, who will introduce our panellists. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So the aim of this panel is to interrogate the status of women in the spheres of print journalism, particularly in areas that they've been excluded from traditionally, which is science journalism, politics, and foreign affairs. And just to provide you some context, the Women in Journalism campaign group did a survey of major national newspapers over the summer, and they found that of all newspaper front page bylines over a period that they looked at in the summer, that only 1/4 were female authored. And that's extraordinary to think that women have been journalists on public newspapers for a very long time. So also in Women in Journalism's survey, they found that of 111 people interviewed on newspaper front pages, only 16% were women, and also of those 111 people quoted, only one was a Black woman. And Eleanor Mills, the chair of Women in Journalism, said obviously that this has got to change, that newspapers simply don't reflect society's diversity. So with me to discuss these issues are Polly Toynbee, the social and political commentator at The Guardian, formerly social affairs editor at the BBC, and author of several books, including the most recent, The Lost Decade, 2010 to 2020, and also Hard Work, Life in Low Pay Britain. I also have great pleasure in introducing Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic, formerly deputy editor of The New Statesman, and author of Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights, that was published earlier this year, and Emily Wilson, the first ever woman editor of The New Scientist magazine, the first woman editor in its 62-year history, and formerly assistant editor of The Guardian. So just to let you know how we're going to do this, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to be taking questions for about 15 minutes that you can submit through the YouTube chat. So I'm going to be kicking off with looking at journalism now and the state of journalism as it was 100 years ago when Time and Tide was first launched. And I've asked the panelists to choose their favourite piece from this fantastic souvenir edition of Time and Tide. And very interestingly, two of our panelists, Emily and Polly, both chose the same piece, which was an article by the writer Winifred Holtby, and it was titled Feminism Divided. And clearly, because it spoke to 2 out of 3 of our panelists very powerfully, it's a good place to start. So Polly, can I ask you first why you chose this piece by Winifred Holtby?
Well, as this Time and Tide is such a lovely, beautiful, it's not exactly a replica because it's a compilation. So here's Winifred Holtby's piece. I'm a huge fan of Winifred Holtby. She's one of the few people to have written a really great book about local government, a subject much, a really great novel, South Riding. She was a terrific feminist, great friend of Vera Britton's. This is a piece that goes right to the heart of, I think, anybody who's been involved in any feminist movement ever. This is called Feminism Divided, and it always is. There are always battles between old feminists, new feminists, young feminists. Every generation kind of reinvents feminism for themselves. And here she is saying she's an old feminist, and these new feminists, who might be these days be called the equivalent of lipstick feminists, are not the real thing. She wants to fight the old fights. She wants to make sure that, you know, for equal pay, for all those basic things that we still haven't got. And she thinks the new feminists are going soft. I mean, I've always been very careful myself not to get involved in these internal battles because, you know, the cat fights that are mocked by our natural enemies of every sort of feminism, seems to me we should spend a lot less time. I mean, the recent one, of course, is the trans battle over trans and what it is to be a woman. I've not got involved in that because, again, I think it utterly destructive of the real battles that we really need to fight and win. And I can't bear to see good feminist causes torn apart and waylaid by these disputes. So I find it interesting that here was Winifred Holtby back then involved in these same old battles that we should try and avoid.
Thank you, Polly. And just picking you up on what you said, so you said we shouldn't be distracted from the battles that we've really got to win. You know, what would you say today are the main battles that women have yet to win?
I'd say it's still about half-made revolution. Equal pay is the most obvious and the one you can count best. But the fact that it's still women who look after children, the fact it's still women whose careers step back when couples have children, tend to go part-time. Most of them never catch up again at the career place they were at before, while their husbands go on ahead in their career, or at least earning more money, if not advancement. I think the fact that when you look at what women do, the great bulk of women are still at the foot of the ladder for pay. They are in care, they're in catering, they're in cashiers as in supermarkets. They are in low-paid jobs, and the jobs are low-paid because they're done by women. It's a kind of circularity. They're disrespected jobs. It's disrespected work because it's regarded as women cleaners as well as carers. And so all of that still has to be turned upside down until we respect the importance of that work that's done. Women will be disrespected, and so will their work be.
Thank you. And so, Emily, why did you choose Winifred Holtby's piece?
For exactly the same reasons as Polly. And if I'd gone first, I would have been just as erudite. No, I agree completely with what Polly said. And I found the piece comforting. I do feel sort of increasing despair over what feel like sort of worse and more bitter divides between feminists and between, you know, women I love, and have formerly always agreed with on things. So I found this comforting, that this is the sort of thing that has gone. I remember when I sort of first became aware of what feminism really was, I think there were divides. It was over, you know, sex work or this or that, but it feels worse now. But anyway, I found this comforting.
Brilliant. So Helen, you chose a very different piece. You chose a piece in the correspondence columns about the Scottsboro case. Can you tell viewers just a little bit about the Scottsboro case and why you were drawn to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an open letter, a format that I normally abhor and disdain, but in this case, I think it's a really interesting historical monument. This is from 1933. The lead signatory is Nancy Cunard, and there are some names on here that will be very familiar to people. You know, Rebecca West, the great feminist, Ezra Pound, famously later poet and anti-Semite, Honourable Brian Guinness, you know, the first husband of Diana Mitford, later married to Oswald Mosley. So it's a kind of interesting who's who of the early 1930s. But the Scottsboro case is one, again, it's interesting that both Polly and Emily brought up, you know, the way that history speaks to today. For me, it's why I'm always so interested in history. The Scottsboro Boys case was a case about on a train, and 9 African-American teenagers were accused of raping 2 white women. Now, it was a completely jumped up charge. One of the complainants revealed during the second trial that she'd been pressured, essentially, you know, bullied into making this up by white men that she knew. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled particularly about all white juries. And how terrible that was to have justice done by people, you know, not by a jury of their peers. And I think it's a really interesting case. It came up, I mentioned it in something that I wrote earlier this year about the word Karen and this insult that is used now on the internet, which is a very online, very Twitter based, oh, you're such a Karen. But what it's got is some roots in there about the difference between white women and ethnic minority men. And actually, where's the power differentiation? Does being white cancel out the disadvantage of being a woman? And those really difficult questions that we now call intersectionality, and the way that different oppressions rub up and against each other. And therefore, I thought it was really interesting that is a case which still has such resonance today. And to me, that's the point of studying history, is to say, hey, but this has all happened before. These are not new questions. We're maybe grappling with them in new language, but you know, these forces are really long-standing.
Absolutely. No, there's lots of change, and yet nothing has changed. And actually, that speaks to the piece I chose, which was a piece in the news section of Time and Tide, which was about Amy Johnson, the Flyers solo flight from London to Australia. 12,000 miles, a huge achievement, and it was reported very soberly in Time and Tide. They celebrate her courage, her determination, and also her technical skills. She had to be really good at fixing engines and that kind of thing. And they say, you know, this is why it's so absurd to say that, you know, women can't do what men can do. Of course they can. And what's interesting to me is the way Time and Tide covered that piece about Amy Johnson compared to the popular newspapers at the time. So for a start, they called her a diminutive, beautiful girl flyer, and they whipped up a non-existent catfight between Amy Johnson and another woman pilot, Peggy Salomon. Again, it's this sort of but often belittling of women who make the public eye, and you know, you can see that actually happening today, can't we, with Kamala Harris. I think it was one of our great national newspapers who described her beauty routine or something like that in the aftermath of her becoming the first woman vice president and black woman vice president of the United States. So now we're going to perhaps take a little step back, halfway back, and I'm going to ask Polly, who the oldest member of our panel, who became a journalist in 1968, and ask you, Polly, what has changed? I'm sure things have changed since you started out as a journalist in 1968.
A lot has changed. I mean, there was only one woman in the lobby, one woman political correspondent, who was Nora Beloff of the Observer, and she was regarded universally as a virago, a battle axe, every kind of, you know, old stereotype of a tough old older woman. But she was very well respected, and she hung in there. But you know, she was the only one. Nearly all of the women journalists, if they were on the serious side, if they weren't doing, you know, the fashion and the soft features, if they were on the news side, we're doing social. you were steered towards, education and health and maybe housing, things like that. You didn't do politics and you didn't do economics. Now I look at The Guardian, we have a woman editor, we have a woman political editor, we have a woman environmental editor, we have nearly all, actually most of our political correspondents are women too. It's been extraordinary. At one point we had a job share for political editor between two women, and that would have been absolutely unthinkable. I mean, it's still pretty exceptional, but you've got Laura Kuenssberg, and I mean, nobody any longer says women can't think right about politics. I suppose what has not changed, abuse of women journalists online is extraordinary, and it does show the extent to which they're still not really accepted. And women writers get far more abuse than men do, and that's been quantified in quite a lot of research. You are much more, the abuse that you get says, you obviously don't know anything about what you're talking about, you stupid woman, why don't you push off, and much ruder than that. Still out there, an underlying sense that you're not up to it, you're not really serious, in a way that when I look at male columnists don't get half as much as we female columnists do.
Yes, so some progress in some areas, but as you say, in our making progress, we've also faced a certain degree of jeopardy, particularly online abuse, and I'm really interested to sort of understand why women who put themselves out there, who put themselves in the public sphere, do seem to be so much more of a target than men. And Helen, you wanted to talk about this particularly.
Do I? I'm not sure I always do, but I totally agree with Polly that it is exactly that. It is the idea that somehow you're illegitimate, your presence in public life is provisional, and I think frankly a lot of it is this kind of form of misogynistic resentment. The kind of, well, hang on a minute, how have you got this job? Why don't I have this job? And that's sort of against the natural order of things. And it's a reflection of how quickly society has changed, that there are men who are feeling a lot more competition than they once did. They're fundamentally competing against a much bigger field than they did. But I think there's also some other related things, which I think that journalists have been encouraged more to see themselves as a kind of personal mini industry. And that hasn't necessarily been particularly good for women. There's a huge premium on very, very opinionated writing and people presenting themselves as kind of stars. But that also means that you're a lot more exposed. You're not writing as the voice of an institution, you're writing as yourself. And with that comes down, I think, a lot more abuse. And then the second thing that, I feel odd that I'm the one speaking about this because I don't have children, but I think there's a huge maternity gap in journalism. Perhaps the biggest thing, I think, as Polly was saying, that is, my journalism course that I did as a postgraduate was just about majority female. My English course at university was majority female. You look around and there is, I used to hire for the New Statesman, absolutely no problem with 20-something women. They're amazing, coming out of your ears. You couldn't hire all of them that there possibly are. And then something happens, and that something is by and large children. And what happens is when you look around at 40, the field has incredibly thinned because it's a very precarious job in lots of senses. It often has very odd hours, very strange demands are made at you. It's very hard for you to kind of demand to be able to switch off. You're supposed to be on your WhatsApp at all hours of the day and night. And for a lot of women still, that is a bargain that they cannot make to juggle that with children. And I don't know, I mean, there's a piece about men doing more, certainly, about it, but is it possible to have, if you're in a heterosexual two-earner couple, is it possible for both of you to be journalists? I think that's and juggle that with kids. It's a really hard thing to make add up, I think. And lots of women are just saying, sorry, no, I'm going to go and work in corporate communications or whatever it might be, because then I know when I finish work for the day, I'm done. Like, that's all you can be expected to ask for me. And that's the big hurdle I would now say for women in journalism is your 30s.
Yeah, no, there's a terrible shedding of talent there. But obviously women have made it to the top, including Emily. And Emily, I wanted to ask you, you're obviously a boss now, you're an editor, and you manage other journalists. Do you think it's made any difference? I mean, how do you think you operate as an editor compared to, say, a male editor, in terms of just how your personnel are deployed and their workload and all that sort of thing? Yeah, can you tell us how you think things have changed when women get to these positions of authority?
Can I just say back to what Helen and Polly were saying first, which is that the only reason I'm editor of New Scientist now is that The Guardian supported me through my 30s, where I, had kids, was away 2 years on maternity leave. And The Guardian kind of supported me in doing job shares and awkward things. But and I have to thank for everything, but it was still very easy working in the newsroom there for kind of a couple of key people to be away, and I would be the only woman in a room full of men, just because of the legacy issue of most people being men and they need to go through the industry before they come up. But also, I still think in many newsrooms there's still quite a macho feeling about the big jobs. You can't do those in a sort of flexible way. The really big jobs, you have to be there every day, and that kind of underlying machismo that does put women off, ends up sort of shedding women who want to work flexibly through their, whenever it is, 30s. That's all still there and it's still going on. And I'm just really lucky that my kids are old enough now I can work full time again, and that I didn't get off ranked in my 30s, which just happens all the time to so many people. To the management thing, I don't know, people do talk about men and women managing differently, but when I think about sort of who I would like to be as a manager, it is a man that I envisage, a man I work for, who I found an exceptional, nuanced, thoughtful, consensual boss. So I think that the difficulty you have as a woman manager is sort of overcoming, and I have now that I'm 50, but for a long time, sort of overcoming your imposter syndrome and not being able to model yourself on anyone in a similar role is always difficult. And it's also particularly then the sort of kind of first stages of things, when you become the first woman boss of something, or for the first woman, I became the first woman boss of many teams before I did New Scientist. And then you've always got, kind of sullen sea of men not delighted, not really showing their delight very obviously. And so then you start questioning your own style, and are you doing it differently from how a man would? But I don't have the data to know, do men and women manage differently? I only know that people manage well or badly, and that there is, corporate style probably eclipses any gender differences, I would think.
Yeah. And Polly, you what do you think? Do you think that having more women at the top of newspapers has made a difference?
Well, there's always the Margaret Thatcher problem. Simply putting a woman somewhere doesn't necessarily. We have a woman editor at the Guardian after many years of promoting women, and she is a woman who herself has promoted many women throughout her career. She was head of the New York, of the American office. She's been head of the Australian office, and she is absolutely not Margaret Thatcher type. But when you look at the women who have been editors, who made the great breakthroughs, what did they edit? The News of the World, the Sunday Express. Is Rebecca Brooks anybody's idea of a role model? So the idea that any one particular woman is necessarily going to fix things or solve problems or change the world isn't the way it goes. It's really when you get enough women in positions of seniority in an organisation that the culture starts to shift. What matters changes, what people worry about changes, what kind of employer you are changes. So it's not the single star who's editing the News of the World that changes the culture of the News of the World. Alas, well, she did in a way, because it's gone through what she did. But So I think one has to be careful about pinning too much on any one person, and it is just a general, when we get to 50-50 everywhere, we may find a cultural change.
In New Scientist, it's not just about having a woman editor now. We've also got a female CEO, female head of marketing, female head of news. About half the senior journalists are women, and probably 2/3 of the directors of the company women. So when you get to those sort of proportions, it does start feeling really different.
Yeah, and Helen, you obviously you've been looking back into history, and I mean, obviously we've all seen The Devil Wears Prada, and we've seen that sort of awful archetype of the female woman, the woman editor who treats her underlings with absolute disregard. Helen, do you think that in the past, particularly when women were just a few of them and they were all struggling to make their way, that they had to behave in a sort of unsisterly way?
I think that if you look at the kind of, from a sort of evolutionary perspective, like it's natural selection, what did that environment, and Polly will know this far better than me, what did the environment of the 1970s say in journalism select for? It selected for people who were, including women, extremely self-confident, able to withstand a huge amount of pressure. When I was writing this book, I kept thinking about those great early female columnists, people like Jean Rook, who wrote a terrible piece, as far as I'm concerned, about the Alvino case, when women wanted just merely to get served at the bar. And she said, it was pathetic whining, and she'd never had any problems getting a job from a man. It was, it was kind of that peak kind of, well, I'm all right, so how can feminism be needed stuff. And I thought, well, that was the kind of woman who was selected for in that environment, somebody who was just incredibly tough. And that probably manifested a lot of saying, why are all these other women complaining so much? Look, I'm here, I haven't got any problems. So I think you have to apply a certain level of, not kindness, but just certainly just awareness that was the way that things worked. And I think what Emily says is entirely true, actually, because what does a newsroom do above anything else? It decides what's interesting. And so it will always be a reflection of the people in that room. And if you're the only woman in that room saying, I think quite a lot of people during the pandemic are quite worried about their childcare, and everybody else has got a stay-at-home wife, you're not going to kind of get anywhere. But if you're in an office where quite a lot of dads, take half the responsibilities, or where, you've got a much more even gender split, then actually lots of other people are going to agree with you that maybe is an interesting thing that you probably should write about. But that's where the change comes. And I agree entirely with Polly that we've had this problem where we put too many expectations on single women to be able to change the world. And then everyone has piled in and given them an enormous kicking when they haven't, surprisingly enough, just on their own been able to do that.
Yeah, and that goes actually to my next question, which is, we all celebrate the fact that women are doing better in journalism, that in some areas, if we said, we do have now 50-50 representation, but what does that achieve? So, what does having more women writing on mainstream newspapers and magazines actually do for women and for society as a whole?
You can. One of our so-called competitors, Scientific American, I can't remember the exact words on the cover. It was this year. It was like women. So it wasn't what makes them tick, but it was something like that, talking about women as the other. And you just know that there was no way that was a 50-50 gender split team that put out that really odd cover. So it's just on a simple level, it makes good business sense if you want a wide range of people to pay for your content, for it to reflect the interests, thoughts and feelings of a wide range of people and not be really weird about some of them.
Yes, and I suppose also that, as you say, so many more people, not just women, but men as well, are now interested in, the issues that were traditionally sort of women's areas. But I just wanted to ask you, Helen, about many women, don't they? They start off their journalistic careers in this sort of feminine pigeonhole. Maybe they write about health or fashion or childcare or that. and that's normally sort of the traditional route then into more sort of mainstream journalism. Is there a danger that women starting out and sort of writing for these traditionally female areas, that they're going to get pigeonholed?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And I think I have a very conflicted relationship with this. I mean, I never wanted to write about those things, although I'm reasonably interested in quite a lot of them, because I did feel that was, not taken seriously in the same way. But I don't think that's not right, is it? That's not something that we should all buy into. And I do think there is a seriousness gap where things that are associated with men are seen as serious, and things that are associated with women are seen as frivolous. And my favourite juxtaposition of this, if you can see it very clearly in newspapers, is if you write about fashion, that is seen to be that you are a kind of trivial person. You don't have any big thoughts to air. If you write about football, however, that's, wow, it's a big sport. There's lots to say about it. You can be one of these people who gets £150,000 a year because, your prose about someone kicking a ball in one direction or another is seen as being so wonderful that you're a huge asset. Now, that's because, newspaper football coverage is incredibly popular. But guess what? So is newspaper features coverage, which has traditionally been the feminine part of the paper. David English, one of the former editors of the Daily Mail, was absolutely obsessed with the features because he knew he had got a majority female audience, and that was what sold the paper just as much as the kind of strong right-wing news angle that he had on the front page. But because it's women doing it, it's like Polly saying about women's jobs become poorly paid jobs. Women's interests become dismissed as frivolous interests, and there is no reason why fashion, which is a multi-billion-dollar global business and an artistic creation, should be inherently dismissed as frippery, whereas football, which is a multi-billion-dollar global business and something that lots and lots of people enjoy doing in their leisure time, is somehow seen as authentic and proper and doesn't diminish you as a serious person.
Absolutely. Emily, what about you? What do you think about this? I don't know, when you started out, were you ever pigeonholed into sort of writing about women's issues?
I was just a general news reporter, so at the time I was the Mirror's only girl reporter. So I was always doing, so this is the sort of mid to late 90s. So I was always doing stunts. I was always having to dress up as a girl chauffeur to drive a lottery winner around, or sort of abseil down a cliff with my bum my bum smaller then, my bum in the picture to go and, interview an activist up a tree. So it wasn't pigeonholed into the women's interest, but I was certainly appeared dressed up as a fool in the paper more often, I would say, than my male colleagues. And maybe this is right or wrong, but I've only worked at 3 different newspapers, but there wasn't the sort of traditionally sort of blokey, your sort of, diplomatic corps or the politics jobs or all those kinds of jobs. The real thing that stopped women going for them, in my experience, was always they were seen as all-consuming big jobs, and you couldn't do it if you were kind of juggling childcare. That was the problem. I was mostly at The Guardian for 18 years. It wasn't that they wouldn't have wanted a woman in those roles. It was they didn't have enough women, didn't have a pool of women who wanted to work like that, or could work like that at those bits of their life. Being a war correspondent, you pay an enormous toll, enormous personal toll anyway, and never mind doing it with kids, for example.
Absolutely. Yes. Have we got Polly back, I think?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay. So obviously, all of us here on this panel, we're all over 25. Maybe we're all over all over 30. So when we all started out as journalists, we were very much in a minority as women. And I just wanted to ask you how you felt entering this profession where you were in such a minority. I'll just kick off with my own. I have to just tell you my own experience. So I started as a cub reporter on the Reading Chronicle, and this was in the late 1980s. My news editor was a lovely chap, but he could not compute the idea of a girl, a young woman news reporter, and he was actually dead set against employing me. But I started getting front page scoops and that kind of thing. And so the way he got round it, he just called me Bert. He just called me He made me an honorary bloke, and that was the way that I got along with him, and he got along with me, and I put up with that because that was the way I was going to get my stories respected. So Polly, obviously starting out in the 60s, you were even more in a minority. How did you feel? I mean, did people say, "What on earth are you doing being a journalist"?
No, it was in the Observer, and so it was more subtle than that. There was just a nudge and a push all the time towards the softer stories and not being given the harder things to do. In the end, I got round that. I went off for a bit and I wrote a book about work, about manual work called A Working Life. And when I came back, I then began to be given industrial labour relations stories, because I'd spent a lot of time on factory floors, and in those days, in the 70s, strikes were it. And any news reporter had to know the rule books of every trade union, and I worked my way into that. But I would always find myself as the only woman covering a strike in a steelworks or whatever, and being treated by other journalists with absolute contempt. You see, girl, you're not going to understand any of this. What do you think you're doing here? A general sense that this is really a man's world, the world of industrial relations and work, and push off. I mean, sometimes they'd be very patronising and give you a helping hand in the way that they might not have done to a male reporter. But mostly, sometimes it was quite helpful, because some people didn't count you. So you would listen to what management was saying or what the strike committee was saying. And it was as if you weren't in the room, because you didn't count, you couldn't. And then if you did actually write down what they said and reported it, they'd be rather shocked because they thought you hadn't counted. Isn't it the tea maker, the secretary?
It was also, wasn't it, in the 1970s that we had the first ever woman president of the National Union of Journalists, and I read a piece about her where when she went to give her first address at the conference, she was greeted by heckles of "Get your knickers down." So yeah, and that was other journalists as well. So Emily, how did you start out, and how did you feel about being in a minority?
I started out 4 years at the Mirror, and then Piers Morgan became editor. It sort of booted me out, roughly speaking, and then I did 2 years at the Mail before I went to the Guardian as a refugee from the tabloids. But broadly speaking, in those sort of 6 years I did on tabloids, I didn't feel it was quite fair, in that if you were a rapacious predator willing to sink your teeth into your prey and get the story, you were fated and sent champagne. So it felt quite fair in that way. The only thing is, the Mail, that the 2 years I was there, Paul Dacre was editor, and there were funny rules about women. So he didn't like women eating at their desk. He wanted us to wear skirt suits, not trouser suits. So there was still some overhangs accompanying his unusual character.
Sorry, Emily, but were men allowed to eat at their desks?
Yeah, he didn't think it was ladylike. I mean, all this thing was sort of passed down through the all-male news desks that then existed. So he never came over and said it to me himself, but it was the law, LORE. It was what it was said to be. Yeah.
Yes. There was a flip side, and not to turn this into the Paul Dacre reminiscence half hour, but I worked at the Mail too for 5 years, and there was also a sense in which that you were tactically used against male news editors. So, for example, when I worked on the features desk, when there was a story that was particularly controversial, we thought I might have a bad reaction, I was kind of sent in on the basis that he wouldn't be that rude to a woman. So you were sort of tactically deployed with the small chivalry G, hopefully going to be activated. But I was thinking about, I don't know if this is an experience maybe that people coming in their 20s will have, but I'm 37 now, and I've still never had a female line manager. I've never had I haven't worked that many different places, but I think that's the bit that we don't necessarily notice, is just how fundamentally male all the structures are. And actually, I think you would really notice if you were a young man coming in and your career was as female dominated as mine has been male dominated, you would feel that was still very unusual, very weird. And part of the project of me writing this book was all about saying these things that we have kind of accepted, that because they've been, the structures have been in place all your life, are actually quite strange and quite weird. And I think that's something in journalism that we just don't realize quite how male it is, because it's always been male. That's just a sort of natural universal state of journalism as far as most people who've worked in it are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've only got a few minutes left, and I did want to just we've talked briefly about the internet in terms of how perhaps on social media particularly women have been targeted more than men, but also obviously the internet has been a huge advance, in terms of how you research your stories and that kind of thing. And I just wanted to end up by asking you, obviously Time and Tide was printed on gorgeous kind of creamy note paper, and now lots of publications are digital, and lots of journalists obviously have to, in the last few months anyway, done all their research using the internet. Has the internet played any role, do we think, in the way women have advanced in journalism? Emily, has it helped you in any way or changed the way you operate?
I know it's much easier to check stuff. When I got to The Guardian, I probably may remember this, in 2000, which doesn't sound that long ago, does it? You had to put your name down on a list if you wanted access to the computer, which had, I can't remember if it was Yahoo or Dolphin or something. You had to queue up to get an access to the online library, which was the internet. So I don't know, it's made journalism a more thrilling place, hasn't it? And given us an entire other world to explore and write stories about. Has it helped me? I don't know. It certainly helps me right now during a pandemic that I can edit a mag from home for however long, 8 months or whatever it's been. And it's the first time in my adult life I haven't commuted. So that's all. So yes, thank you, internet.
Yeah. I mean, I remember doing, when I was doing sort of health features, actually having to go to a specific health library somewhere in Holborn and asking for journals and taking me sort of 3 or 4 days to find something you could find at a touch of a button now. But Helen, what about you? Obviously, you work for The Atlantic. Have you noticed a change in the way you operate, or do you think journalism is changing as a result of this online world we have at our fingertips?
I mean, it's changed enormously, and one of the most obvious ways that shows up is the fact that Facebook and Google have essentially a duopoly on online advertising. The small ads and the classifieds that would have supported local newspapers, even when I was a teenager, have gone. All that money has gone out of journalism, and display advertising pays pennies for thousands of page views in a way that you were able to sell a newspaper or a magazine like Time and Tide for a reasonable amount of money that was enough to pay journalists a reasonable salary. And so journalism has become a lot more precarious as a job. It's also become a lot more middle class as a job. I was working with people at the start of my career who had left school at 16 and had to do a mandatory 2 years of working on local papers before they were allowed to Fleet Street under union rules. That doesn't happen anymore. It's not just university graduates, it's usually postgraduates now who are coming in then graduate schemes. And they're often working in incredibly fast-paced environments, churning out huge numbers of stories a day. Because, as Emily said, the problem is it being very quick to check stuff, is it's also very quick to spin up some stories out of some flam you found on social media. So we have these two twin things going on, that everybody talks more about the stuff that's happening online in this sort of weird global community, particularly very dominated by America. And there's less and less attention paid to things that are happening at the end of your street. The courts are incredibly undercovered now, for example, because all of that local journalism has died. And that's got different effects in a gender way. I think it's been really good for female freelancers, of whom there are a huge number, to be able to work from home, and even before the pandemic. And we really could actually now take more advantage of the ability for people not to have to live in very expensive cities like London and still do some journalism jobs, which would help with the incredible endemic problem that journalism has of being dominated by the top sections of societies, including those who can afford to live with their parents in London for several years working low-paid jobs. So, the internet story has been a very depressing one to my mind, but I'm hopeful that something can be salvaged from it.
Thank you. And so just to wrap up then, Polly, just taking that on, I mean, do we hope that women's position in journalism, I mean, as Helen said, it may be that as it gets a more precarious profession, you may ironically have more women in it as men go to the sort of safer, better paid jobs. Can you see a joyful future for women journalists?
Yes, I think so. There's been such huge advances. I think there will be more and more women. Their voices will be taken more and more seriously. They're in every single field. I mean, look at Emily. I think it's going to improve. It's going to go on getting better. I don't think there's anywhere in that. I think the class question will be the next, will become more pressing than the question of women in journalism, not in general, but in journalism. I think so. I think what Helen says is right. It's very, very middle class dominated. To have to get a postgraduate degree, to have to start out with, no money in mostly in London. You need backing behind you, and I think that'll be a bigger issue. So I'm optimistic about women. Yes.
Hooray.
If we conquer this battle, the gender bit, then we can start focusing on different kinds of diversity, and we will. I agree.
Excellent. So we've got questions, a lot of questions actually. So I'm going to read them out in the order I've been sent them, and I suppose just leap in or put your hand up or something if more than one of you wants to answer. So Jeffrey Reed asks us, actually I'm going to ask each of you in turn, starting with you, Emily, as you're on my screen. Which female journalist has inspired you the most?
I guess Kath Viner, who's the editor of The Guardian, because I'm not sure anyone in the world has really inspired me per se, but I'll pick out Kath, because if it wasn't for Kath, I wouldn't be in my job now. When I was sort of like a kind of like middling minion on the features desk with a baby, she's the person who kind of helped me put together my first job share and allowed me to go on to years of job sharing, which allowed me to not off ramp. So and she was so she was truly inspiring in the way she supported women, even though it was a pain in her butt to have a job sharing deputy. And also she was inspirational in it sounds like a small thing, but she would never send a page of the newspaper without having read every single word on it down to the last full stop. And that was very, very good advice in particular.
Wonderful. Helen, which women journalist has inspired you the most?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, one of them being Nellie Bly, who, a great 20th century journalist, got herself committed to what was then called an insane asylum to expose the conditions that were in it. But there's a great tradition, particularly in America, of female essayists that I really love. So I'm thinking of Joan Didion, Janet Malcolm, women who went through at that time when that was a superbly blokey area, long form journalism, where it was considered, the boys' domain. And they just, through the sheer brilliance of their, acuity and what they wrote about, they bulldozed their way into it. And that's the tradition that I love to think that I am writing in, hopefully.
Fantastic. Polly? I'd choose somebody very unlike me, Claire Hollingworth, war correspondent. She happened to be, she was lucky, she happened to be on the border when the German tanks rolled into Poland. And she saw it and she reported it. First, they refused to believe it. It can't be happening. It can't be true. But she persuaded her editor. They published the story. And she, absolutely indefatigable war correspondent throughout her life. And I interviewed her towards the end of her life. And she was remarkable. So it took incredible women of extraordinary bravery who just battered their way through, you wouldn't call it a glass ceiling, but every obstacle in their way, and showed that women can do it. She was the kind of Amy Johnson equivalent, perhaps, for war correspondents.
Yes, absolutely. The tanks are coming from Poland into Poland. Yes. Okay, so Margaret Hughes asks, again, probably a quick answer from all three of you. In terms of starting out, what would you advise young women, indeed any woman who joins journalism today? Any advice? Polly, I've got you on screen, so do you want to kick off?
Well, I'm often asked, I think I would advise people to try and specialise, to acquire, to become a, you don't have to be a specialist from your university degree or whatever. But if you specialise, and it doesn't matter if it's quite a small niche, and you become an expert in something, it might be in health journalism, it might be in something more particular, you gain a kind of weight, a kind of seriousness of reputation that then you can spread out, and you don't have to be stuck in that specialism forever. But otherwise, you're always at risk of being treated rather like Emily said she was, being sent off as the girl reporter to do ridiculous things and not being taken seriously. So get yourself taken seriously in something or another as soon as you can.
Yes, Emily, yes, your anecdote reminded me of that Bridget Jones clip when she comes down the fire and
yeah. I would add to what Polly said. I would say, as well as kind of specialising, I would say also treat every story with deadly seriousness. Every time, whatever the story is, however small the story is, make sure you have rung, a bunch of people. All those people are future contacts for you for your whole career. If you show yourself to be an honourable and serious journalist to them, it begins building a reputation for yourself. If you've taken that story really seriously, you will understand every word in it. It will all be right. When it goes to the news editor, it will establish your reputation with them, because if they start to kick the tire of a line in the story, you'll have a lot of background behind that one sentence that you wrote. So never just smash something out kind of half considered and half understood. You will regret it. It will bite you in the arse.
Thank you. Helen, what advice would you give?
I mean, I agree with all of that. And also, if you possibly can, go to an institution that will invest in you. I think it's a real problem for young journalists if they end up in places that just want to use them as kind of content farming machines, versus the places that really think about wanting you to have a proper long career and grow you as a person. And the second thing I would say, which I say to all young journalists who ask me, is find out what happens when I Google you and make sure that looks good. Make sure you've got a professional looking Twitter account, you've got a WordPress blog that's, set up with your clips on it, because that's the first encounter that I'm probably going to have with you if you send me, a pitch or you want some help from me or something like that. And it's amazing how many people you just find their old school photos and, weird Instagram pictures of them at the beach, and you kind of like, it's not really giving off the vibes that you probably want here.
Fantastic. There's some top tips there. And actually, Helen, while I've got you, so Richard Rees O'Brien asks, looking a few decades ahead, what are the qualitative as opposed to quantitative changes you would hope to see in mainstream journalism?
Love the qualitative versus quantitative. That's a very difficult one, isn't it? I think I would like it if journalism, if we find it a model for public service journalism that is ultimately sustainable. I think we've been through a very bad 15 years or so in terms of what ad funding has done to journalism, which has encouraged clickbait and conspiracy theory sites and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I feel like the tide is turning. The Guardian's now got a very successful donation model, membership model. The Atlantic, where I work, has got an incredibly successful subscription model, which only launched last year. So we're getting back to the idea that journalism is worth paying for, and journalists are, real specialist journalists who know what they're talking about, are worth paying. And that, to me, is the trend that I would like to see continuing, is the idea that journalism is essential to democracy. Democracy has not had a particularly good few years in lots of countries around the world. And actually, that is the trend that needs to be reversed, and journalism is part of that.
Absolutely. Polly or Emily, would you like to add anything?
I don't think she could have said it better. I agree 100%. She's totally right. Taking journalism seriously and journalists taking themselves seriously. Yes.
Great. So Debbie from the LSE Library asks, she said, I'm wondering about assumptions made about women without children in politics and the media too. For example, Theresa May's infertility was dredged up in 2016. Would a man have the same issues kind of held against him? Anyone want to talk about the sort of the representation of women, I mean, either as mothers or not as mothers?
I mean, if you want, I can, as official representative of women without children on the panel, I can probably do that because, yeah, I think it was very unfair. And I think that there is still a problem that women without children particularly are seen as somehow incomplete, you know, that they're not fully rounded people, that they, you know, something is missing from their lives. And actually, occasionally when a particularly nasty bloke tries to bring something down, they sort of say things to me like, you know, your eggs are shrinking and you're going to die alone. And you think, well, you're sending, you know, you're sending hatred to people anonymously on the internet, so I wouldn't necessarily get into that competition of who's going to be most beloved in their older years, sir. But you know, it is a thing that is thrown at women, and it comes back to what Polly was saying right at the start about women being seen as their natural place being in the home and in the domestic sphere, and if they're not there, there's something sort of weird and monstrous about it. But equally well, I don't think it's any better for women who do have children in politics, because, you know, when I did some research once, I discovered that the average number of children that a man in the cabinet had was far more than the average number of children that a woman in the cabinet had. And, you know, if you're a man in politics, having some adorable little children mingling around humanizes you. But, you know, are you there doing the school pickup? And I think both David Cameron and Nick Clegg were quite brave to go into Downing Street saying, actually, we are going to do that. And they got the kind of buckets of ordure that you'd expect from that. But there's still this problem that as a woman, you're screwed either way. Either you're not a full person because you haven't had children, or you've got children and all the hours in the day that those children take up hold you back. So there is no way to win.
No, you're considered that you're not taking life quite seriously, aren't you, if you've got young children, if you're a woman.
I think it's, can I just say, I think it's interesting the extent to which a couple of decades ago you would have looked at women who had got to the top, whether in business or journalism or politics, and there would be a surprising number of them who didn't have children, whether that's Margaret Beckett, whether that's, you know, Theresa May, and you go through them, it was odd how many didn't. And I think that's slightly less so now. I think that, you know, it's got a bit easier for women with children to get to those very top jobs. Though, as Helen says, you know, probably still fewer of them compared with the men.
No, absolutely. Okay, so I've got a question here which I like because it name checks my book. Kate MacDonald says, after reading Sarah's book about interwar women journalists, I'm interested in feminist leadership in journalism in the regional press. I mean, I don't know if any of you have read that fabulous book by Monica Dickens, My Turn to Make the Tea, where as a regional girl reporter, she was always the one, it was always her turn to make the tea. And my book references a woman called Stella Martin from the Bristol Evening Press. Are there any great women regional journalists, either now or in the past, that you would like to name check or talk about?
That's a very good question, because all the ones that immediately come to mind now are, you know, are men. But for example, someone who's working now, I think is brilliant. Jennifer Williams at the Manchester Evening News.
I say that myself. Yes.
She's really owned that beat, and actually she shows the power of what it means to know a community. Because when the lockdown restrictions controversy kicked off in Manchester, and obviously Andy Burnham gave his sort of stirring press conference with outside whatever the steps of that was. You know, she was absolutely there, and she's asked questions in the Downing Street press conferences that have been specifically based around her region. And, you know, I've got friends who live in Greater Manchester who felt really forgotten. You know, they felt they were in harder tier restrictions, and because London wasn't, basically no one cared. And that again shows to me the point of having local journalism, of having voices in those communities. And she, to me, represents somebody who is grounded absolutely in her community, doing a form of journalism that, as I said before, is essential to democracy.
That kind of journalism is increasingly rare, isn't it? I mean, it just is. You know, here where I live in Dorset. Sorry, I knew the dog bark at least once. Sorry.
Okay, we're running out of time, but we do have more. I just try and squeeze in maybe one or two more. So Annalise Edwards asks about abuse of women journalists. She asks, do we know where it's coming from? Is it mainly from men or is it from women? And is it letters? Is it typing? Is it online? Do we know? Do we know where this abuse of women journalists is coming from?
I personally don't get much, but I do occasionally get a letter from a reader blaming me for something that New Scientist did long before I joined, or for a piece I've had nothing to do with, basically blaming, you know, why they don't like that piece on me. But I think that's at the most benign end of the kind of misogyny that's poured at women.
Anyone else want to leap in there before we
I'm afraid that I think it does come from men and women. I think the fact that it's directed towards women is very noticeable, but there is a big premium on being, and it comes back to what Emily and Polly were saying, the feminism divided. There's a big premium on being the right kind of feminist and being on the right side. And actually, you're never more popular as a feminist than when you're in a cat fight with someone who's deemed to be the wrong kind of feminist. So for as much as I get abuse from sexist men, I get quite a lot of abuse for being the wrong kind of feminist from other women too. So it's not a particularly simple picture.
No. And the last question from Meg Montague actually kind of speaks to this in a way. She says intersectionality was mentioned at the start, and I was wondering what responsibility you think white women may or may not have to ensure women of colour are also represented in newsrooms. Anyone want
Absolutely have responsibility, but I mean, so do men. The idea that women are kind of especially caring and especially nice, and especially good and especially socially concerned, given that men still have most of the power, it's even more important that men should be utterly aware of the extent to which ethnic diversity is still thin on the ground. But it's an equal responsibility for men and women.
Yeah, but it is, we've started, where I work at New Scientist, we've started a diversity intern scheme. Started last year, we churned out 3 exceptional science journalists from BAME backgrounds last year, 2 of them women, one of whom we've hired, the other 2 we're still using every day. And we've just taken in 3 quite confused new interns who now don't know any of us or don't know where, never been to the office, whatever. But sort of kind of being able to produce young female science journalists from BAME backgrounds, I think is, even if it's only at the rate of 2 years, I think a big deal. And I intend to keep doing it every year that I'm at New Scientist.
Fantastic. And just to say, I've noticed, as speaking as an academic, I've noticed very much on the other side. Since the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer, I've had lots and lots of publications writing to me saying, can we take your BAME students for work experience, because we realise there's a lot we have to do to increase the diversity in our publications. So people are definitely thinking about it, but it's definitely coming through, but it's obviously a very slow thing. Well, we've run out of time, everybody. So thank you so much for a fascinating discussion about women in journalism. Thank you, Helen, Emily, and Polly.